message, stay at home. But we do have to acknowledge that this advice is being done on the basis, as James said, of imperfect data. I think yesterday the number of new infections spiked again. So it looked like it was flattening out and then it went up.
Yeah.
And most worryingly...
Just on that, Lenore, sorry to jump in, I think we also saw a big jump in the number of tests that took place yesterday, a huge jump. So that may account for what we saw there.
True. But there was also a jump in the number of locally acquired cases.
Yeah.
And I think this is what's really going to factor into the decisions, which, as you said, are some of the biggest decisions that political leaders have taken probably in our lifetimes. That once we have a lot of locally acquired cases, I think then the case for dialing the economy down further becomes overwhelming.
What's been notable this week, as I mentioned, is the Prime Minister also starting to mount a very strong argument about the health costs, the danger to lives of actually shutting down more of the economy. Here he was.
We're dealing with a health crisis that has caused an economic crisis. And I am very concerned about the economic crisis that could also take a great toll on people's lives, not just their livelihoods. The stresses that will put on families. The things that can happen when families are under stress. I'm as concerned about those outcomes as I am about the health outcomes of managing the outbreak of the coronavirus.
Now, Mark, he's not explicit there, but clearly there are valid concerns about suicide, about domestic violence, about substance abuse, and kids becoming completely disengaged from schooling and so on. All of these things can happen and do happen in depressions, and if more people are forced to stay home, there will be these sort of impacts.
Oh, absolutely, David. I mean, what we're talking about here is a fundamental and very rapid transformation of our society, disintegration of it, really. We're sort of being asked to kind of individualise, to atomise our society, to retreat into our houses, and that changes everything. It changes the economy, it changes the socialisation process, and we get all kinds of dysfunctions out of that. We know that from history, but we're in a very novel situation at the moment, so everyone's flying blind, but it's not like there's a lot of discretion here. Governments are just having to do what they can and take what measures they can in order to deal with this. And there will be these very furious debates, I suppose, in sections of the community about whether the government is doing enough and whether more should be done and how quickly it ought to be done. I think Lenore's point's a very good one, though, in terms of the communication issue, because that has emerged as a very big talking point, really. The confusion that people have about the mixed messages and just this sort of complexity of the way this all applies to across society to different people, who's allowed to do what and where. And that makes it, I think, quite hard. It doesn't just make it hard to communicate, but I think it actually undermines confidence in the overall process.
Just on that point, Mark, I mean, is it, sure, it would be cleaner and simpler if you just said everything's shut, but is it worth going that far if it does put people out of work that don't need to be put out of work for the sake of a simpler message?
Well, I don't think it's just for the sake of a simpler message. I mean, as Lenore said, this is happening anyway at a ferocious rate across society. So there's that aspect of it, but there's also a degree of clarity in terms of the rules that will then, or the provisions that would then apply to those people who are the subject of the shutdown, people who immediately lose their jobs. That whole situation is suddenly clarified, and I think there have been even, you've had an interesting confluence of both employees and employers actually calling for a shutdown, people who would actually be directly and materially disadvantaged by that shutdown, you would think. But what they want is some sort of clarity so that employers can know that someone stood down, that's the end of paying their entitlements for a time, but that then what happens after that can flow, what happens after that in terms of assistance and so forth.
James, the other point to make, though, is that it's not the Prime Minister acting alone here. Yes, there have been strains and some differences amongst the National Cabinet of state and federal leaders, but Victoria and New South Wales still have not moved to the next stage of restrictions. They are saying where we're at is appropriate. They agree where we're at is appropriate for right now.
In public, in private, they want more. but they're committed to working through this process.
Well, if they want more, surely they should do more.
Do they want to break? The question is, do they break with this process? I mean, they tried last Sunday to bounce the federal government into moving forward. They didn't get there. They're going to have another go, you would imagine, in the next few days. If I could go back to what Mark was saying, the reality is there is an economic case for further shutdowns. The longer we continue to trade, essentially insolvent, there are no customers, the wages bills still coming out the door, rents are being paid, all this sort of stuff. The businesses are in a worse and worse condition the longer trading goes on. If we think that the train is going to the station marked complete shutdown, we should basically go there as quickly as possible. The longer we go through this sort of half-life at the moment, where the economy is sort of open but sort of closed and everybody's going broke at once, the worse it's going to be.
Well, if we are moving to further restrictions and a whole lot more people joining that jobless queue, clearly that comes to the debate around what economic support is needed. And as mentioned at the top there, the government is clearly shifting now behind the idea where we've seen other countries go of a wage subsidy. Labor, before we get to Matthias Cormann, the Finance Minister, Labor has been out calling for that this week. Here's Tony Burke.
Employers are facing right now, what decisions am I going to make when my income is collapsing? And if the best the government is offering is for an employee on median wages a 20% support, and from the employer's perspective, you'll only miss out on the second quarter's payment. If you sack all your staff now, you'll still get the first payment. Then no wonder we're seeing the Centrelink queues that we're seeing.
Matthias Cormann, welcome to the program. On this wage subsidy idea, 2 days ago you said we will not look at a UK-style system because in an Australian context that just wouldn't work. Is that still your view?
Well, I mean, that's right. And I mean, as I understand it, the UK, while they've made certain announcements, I'm not sure that they've actually been able to roll it out. What we are looking at, I mean, our first priority was to provide a significantly boosted income support to those Australians who have lost their job, and we are providing income support double the rate compared to what was in place before. We are working to significantly expand that as part of a third wave of reforms, as we flagged, and as I also flagged in that interview that you've just quoted. But we are going to do it in an Australian way. We're going to do it in a way that actually is going to be able to be delivered using our existing systems and our existing architecture. I mean, that was the point that I was making at the time. I mean, just making a broad promise without giving ourselves the capacity to deliver would not be a responsible thing to do. So we are working very hard on further expanding the level of income support through businesses to enable more businesses either to stay in hibernation or to survive through this difficult period ahead for a strong bounce back on the other side.
Okay, so just clear this up for us. Does that mean subsidising employees' wages if a business keeps them on their staff?
Well, what it means is providing significantly enhanced income support through business. What form that will take, will be announced once all of those decisions have been made. I mean,
but with a requirement to keep staff employed?
That would be the intention, and that is what we're currently working on. But how that will work in practice, that is what we're working through. And I mean, our commitment is to do this through our existing systems, the tax system and the existing welfare system, so that we do actually have the capacity to deliver this on a large scale.
I'm told the government is